We tend to receive the mask as a showcase for Jim Carrey's physical comedy, a riot of cartoon special effects. But behind that facade lies a precise study of what you might call nice guy syndrome. Stanley Ipkiss is not simply a mild-mannered bank clerk. He is a clinical example of a personality whose social mask, or persona, in Jungian terms, has been developed to its absolute extreme. He is so thoroughly oriented around softness and self-sacrifice that his authentic self has been completely buried under layers of imposed agreeableness. For Stanley, being good is not a considered moral position. It is a survival strategy driven by a deep-seated fear of rejection. In psychology, this pattern is often characterized as compulsive compliance, a surface of meekness concealing quietly simmering resentment. He operates on the belief that any form of assertiveness will mark him as selfish in the eyes of others, so he moves through life suppressing his authentic reactions. But the human psyche is a self-regulating system. According to Carl Jung, excessive one-sidedness in consciousness is inevitably compensated for by the activity of the unconscious. The Mask of Loki in this story functions not as an external source of power, but as a radical instrument of de-individuation. It does not add anything new to Stanley. It strips him bare, bringing to the surface the parts of himself he was too afraid to show. All the accumulated ambition, sexual energy, and aggression he had deemed unacceptable in himself erupt in the form of the green-faced trickster. It is not magic that makes him a hero. It is his own shadow, freed of its social breaks, finally getting a voice. Stanley Ipkiss's problem is not that he is kind. It is that he is pathologically incapable of drawing a line between himself and the world. In psychology, this is described as the absence of functional personal boundaries. For someone with nice guy syndrome, any attempt to say no or protect their own interests feels equivalent to an act of aggression. Stanley operates on a core belief: if I make myself easy to be around, I won't be rejected. This turns his life into an endless sequence of small humiliations, which he absorbs with an apologetic smile, suppressing every natural impulse toward self-protection. Healthy boundaries are not a wall. They are the immune system of the psyche, the mechanism that allows a person to determine what is acceptable to them and what is not. Stanley's immune system is switched off. He lets his mechanic cheat him, his boss demean him, and his landlady invade his privacy. Every time he swallows an injury to preserve his image as a nice guy, he commits a small betrayal of himself. This inability to express anger in a healthy way, anger which, in a functional psyche, serves as a signal to protect one's boundaries, means the aggression doesn't disappear. It gets pushed into the unconscious, where it accumulates as toxic pressure. The connection between nice guy syndrome and the subsequent explosion of personality under the mask is direct. The weaker the real-world boundaries, the more devastating the compensation through the shadow. Suppressed emotions don't die. They wait for the moment when the brakes fail. The mask, therefore, becomes for Stanley not merely an adventure, but a brutal lesson in the fact that the psyche does not forgive the chronic neglect of its own needs. It is a vivid demonstration of how the refusal to build boundaries in everyday life inevitably produces destructive consequences when the accumulated pressure finally breaks through the dam of civility. To understand why the mask turns a mild-mannered clerk specifically into a manic trickster, we need to look at how psychological compensation actually works. According to Jung, the unconscious is always working to balance out the one-sidedness of consciousness. If Stanley in real life is a sterile persona, toothless, clawless, then his shadow will inevitably accumulate everything that was sacrificed to maintain that flawless agreeableness. The mask does not give him new qualities. It simply lifts the block on impulses that already exist but have been driven underground. The nature of that suppression is usually dictated by social scripts installed in us in childhood. We are taught to divide our feelings into acceptable and inadmissible, based on what the people around us expect. Girls are frequently given the message, "You should be soft, anger isn't ladylike." The result is that their natural aggression and ambition get pushed into the shadow. And as adults, these women may find themselves in conflict situations where they dissolve into tears rather than standing their ground. Anger is off limits for them. Tears are the socially approved form of yielding. For boys, the dynamic is often reversed. The prohibition on tears and vulnerability, "men don't cry," means that any emotional pain gets rerouted into the one mode that is permitted and familiar: aggression. For Stanley, the mask becomes the instrument that overrides these internal editorial rules. Everything he considered wrong in himself, his buried rage, his hunger for recognition, his right to take up space and be loud, had been stockpiling in the basement of his psyche for years. His shadow is not simply chaos. It is a concentrated reserve of life energy that he had never allowed himself to use, terrified of shattering the nice guy image. The green-faced trickster revels in breaking the rules precisely because in ordinary life, Stanley had been their willing prisoner. The explosion is a direct illustration of the principle that suppressed emotions do not evaporate. They wait for the moment the social brakes fail, then announce themselves with twice the force. To confirm that the mask simply visualizes what is already inside, it is enough to compare Stanley with the other characters who wear it. The artifact does not impose Loki's will. It acts as a mirror, reflecting back what a person has been suppressing, or alternatively, what they have already fully become. The contrast between the characters illustrates the central point. The mask does not create a personality from scratch. It illuminates the psychological cargo that was already there. Dorian Tyrell is what happens when the shadow has already consumed almost the entire personality. Unlike Stanley, Dorian has no internal conflict between good guy and monster. His conscious self is already a brutal predator, one with no guilt mechanism and no social brakes. For him, the mask does not become a liberating instrument or a playful trickster. It simply removes the last remaining traces of a human face, turning him into a grotesque, physically distorted embodiment of his sadistic impulses. There is no escape from the prison of politeness here, only an amplification of evil that was already fully formed. Dorian's mask is direct evidence that if a person has nothing inside them but the drive for power, the magic will simply give that drive a more terrifying shape. Milo the dog shows us pure instinct. Animals have no social camouflage. They do not suffer from nice guy syndrome, and they do not attempt to meet the complex expectations of polite society. Under the mask, Milo expresses raw natural dominance and territoriality. His transformation is the most healthy in the film because it is entirely free of human distortion and internal conflict. It reminds us that at the root of every shadow lie ancient survival mechanisms, ones that in human beings are buried under a very thick layer of civilization and prohibition. The contrast points to the central danger. How a person's hidden force expresses itself depends entirely on how honestly they engage with their shadow in ordinary life. Where Stanley finds his way to integration through chaos, Dorian loses his humanity completely, becoming a prisoner of his own darkness. The mask only lifts the covering, reminding us that behind every facade lies something far deeper and more authentic than what we typically choose to show the world. The film's crisis point arrives in Stanley's admission, "I'm nobody without the mask." This is a moment of acute disintegration. The social facade has fully collapsed. But there is nothing stable underneath it. Possession of the magical artifact becomes an addiction, operating by the same mechanism as a chemical dependency. The mask offers Stanley an irresistible deal: temporary, effortless liberation from the chains of politeness in exchange for complete surrender of control over his own life. For someone who has spent years suppressing their impulses, this kind of shortcut to confidence becomes a trap. Instead of learning to build boundaries and express healthy assertiveness in reality, Stanley retreats behind the omnipotent alter ego. This creates a dangerous illusion. That strength is something external, something you can put on and take off. The problem is that the shadow, once it has an outlet through the artifact, begins to dominate consciousness, and the boundary between Stanley himself and the chaotic trickster dissolves. At this point, the character faces a fundamental choice: continue escaping reality, remaining a pushover in life and all-powerful in the mask, or take the harder path of integration. The kind of grandiose, infantile omnipotence the mask provides is not adult strength. It's a child's fantasy of power without responsibility. Real strength lies not in giving the shadow full control, but in acknowledging it as part of yourself and learning to channel its energy in ordinary life. Stanley has to understand that the assertiveness, the charisma, and the courage the mask expressed were always inside him. They simply needed to be recognized, not magically unlocked. This is the transition from the fantasy of unlimited power to adult responsibility for one's own wholeness. Stanley Ipkiss's story ends in an act of genuine individuation. In the finale, he finds the strength to throw the mask away of his own free will, a gesture that symbolizes the voluntary release of a destructive defense mechanism. He no longer needs a magical intermediary to be himself. He has recognized his own strength, learned to hold his boundaries, and integrated the energy of his shadow into real life. For Stanley, this path ends in healing because he understood in time that the mask should not replace the person. It can only show them what they are missing in order to be whole. In actual psychology, however, this kind of resolution is the happy exception rather than the rule. If a person continues for years to ignore their genuine needs, if fear of rejection becomes stronger than the will to live, and if nice guy syndrome hardens into impenetrable armor, the psyche will find other ways to make itself heard. Suppressed emotions that cannot find release through humor or healthy aggression do not simply vanish. They begin to dismantle their host from the inside. When the prohibition on feeling becomes total, the shadow stops being a playful trickster and becomes something frightening and uncontrollable. If it cannot get out through laughter and action, it begins to surface through the body itself, changing not only the psyche, but the person's physical condition. What happens when the refusal to be yourself in pursuit of impossible perfection is taken all the way to its end? That is what we will look at in the next part, through the story of Nina Sayers in Black Swan. If this kind of exploration, finding the self beneath the cinematic surface, resonates with you, leave a like and subscribe. It genuinely helps. And tell us in the comments, have you ever recognized nice guy syndrome in yourself, and how did you start finding your way back to your own boundaries? See you in the next one.